Welcome to the Ottawa International Writers Festival. My name is Sean. I'm the festival's artistic director. We are broadcasting from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. And on behalf of the festival and our partners, the Ottawa Public Library and Library and Archives Canada, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's conversation on inequality and the economy. I want to thank you in advance for supporting authors and booksellers through these difficult times. Our official bookseller is Perfect Books on Elgin Street, but wherever you are right now, there's an independent bookseller nearby or online who would be more than happy to sell you 5, 6, or 7 copies of Tomas's book. If you enjoy this session, visit us at thewritersfestival.org to make a donation, sign up for upcoming events, or to enjoy our virtual season on demand. It's as simple as picking what you want to watch and pressing play. Our host this evening is the ever-astounding Mark Sutcliffe, an entrepreneur, writer, and broadcaster. You can catch Mark at a number of our events at writersfestival.org or on the radio or through his fantastic new podcast, Digging Deep. Let's give a warm virtual Ottawa welcome to our host this evening, Mark Sutcliffe.
Thank you so much, Sean, and welcome everyone. It's great to be with you tonight. I'm really looking forward to this conversation with Tomas Philippon, whose new book is called The Great Reversal: How America Gave Up on Free Markets. And we are going to have a wide-ranging discussion about that tonight, and we look forward to your participation in that conversation. So if you have a question, please share it with us in the Q&A format on Zoom or through Facebook. Share that question with us, and we will get to your questions a little bit later this hour. We welcome all of your questions and look forward to addressing as many of them as we can. So, first of all, a warm welcome to Tomas Philippon. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, it's a pleasure.
So this book actually arises out of an interesting personal experience that you had when you moved to New York City from France. Can you tell us that story to start with?
Yes, so I came to the US 20 years ago because I came as a student. So I wanted to do my PhD. I went to Boston to study economics. And so I arrived in the US 20 years ago, 1999. And of course, as a student, I was pretty careful with prices and what I was buying. And I quickly noticed that many of the items that I wanted to buy as a student were cheaper in the US than they were in France. So for instance, buying a laptop, okay, or getting an internet connection to your home, getting a cell phone connection, and then flying around. For instance, as a student in Europe, I don't think I ever flew to any conference. I would drive, or I would take the bus, or maybe take the train. And in the US, I discovered where I could fly to Chicago to go to a conference because plane tickets were, significantly cheaper than they were in France and in Europe 20 years ago. So this is the US that I discovered. And already that was a puzzle, by the way, because the US being richer than Europe by about 10–20%, you would expect prices to be higher in the US. Like for the same reason, a haircut costs more in New York than in Beijing. This kind of non-traded services should be more expensive in richer countries. And it was the opposite. So that's interesting. 20 years later, much to my surprise, it's when I go back to Europe that I have the same shock in reverse, right? Where in the US, people pay 2 to 3 times more what my parents and friends pay in France for either their broadband connection at home or their cell phone plans every month. So it's not just that the difference was small before. The difference was very large to the advantage of the US. And it's not that the gap became zero. It became extremely large the other way. Okay, so we went from a situation where the US had much more market-friendly, consumer-friendly markets to a situation where, at least for these markets, Europe gives a much better deal to people than the US. And so when I realized that, I gotta admit that I should have realized it earlier, but it still took 20 years. Then I started, maybe there's something interesting, and I started digging out to figure out what happened.
So what did happen? Again, you're illustrating that this all took place in the space of 20 years, which is a really short period of time for such a dramatic change to occur. Was it something that happened in the United States? Was it something that happened in Europe, or was it both?
Yeah, so that's where it gets interesting. I think it's clearly both. although the dynamics are a bit different and the story is a bit easier to tell in Europe. The story in Europe is really quite simple. Europe started to do after the mid-90s, say in the 2000s, Europe started to do exactly what the US had been doing during the 1990s. So it was not rocket science. It was not a new idea. It was literally implementing the kind of policies that had proven effective in the US, which is essentially, free market with redistribution. So free market in the sense that we don't like monopolies. We like competition. We like firms to compete with each other because that gives a good deal to consumers. It gives them choices and low prices. So we started to remove all the state monopolies. Air France was the only airlines in France, and France Telecom was the only telecom provider in France. And now these markets are hugely competitive today, and people have many choices and they pay less. Okay. So we did that over, say, the period 2000 to 2015 in many markets in Europe. And it was an inspiration that had some European roots that we can discuss later, and even some kind of interesting paradox, because it's kind of weird for countries that individually don't have a tradition of free market to suddenly team up and produce the opposite outcome of what you would expect based on their individual history. So there's something there that's kind of funny to understand. But by and large, these were ideas that had been, vetted in the US, and the inspiration clearly, and even some of the technical way it was done, was inspired by the US. Now, in the US, over the same period of time, it looked like the country forgot its own history and started to stop enforcing the policies that lead to free market outcomes in a bunch of industries. But unlike in Europe, where I can sort of pinpoint what happened because it was tightly linked to the creation of a single market, in the US, there is no obvious turning point. It looks like it happened slowly after 2000s, and we can point towards campaign finance, political issues. We can point towards 9/11. We can point towards various kind of policies, but it's not extremely clear what triggered the change. All we can see is the slow drift away from markets where consumers get a good deal, and a lot of lobbying by firms to keep their profit margins.
So it's hard to know why it happened in the United States, but what you're describing is that the United States is less of a free market economy than it was 20 years ago, even though we still, I think, without looking at the data, most people in the world would view the United States as kind of the best example of a free market economy where competition rules supreme.
Yeah, that's basically wrong. But I don't blame people, because honestly, that's what I thought 2 years ago. So literally, before writing the book, that was my belief, because it used to be true, and it was true for the longest time. And the US essentially invented modern antitrust, was the first one to implement it successfully, has the tradition of free market. So yes, I think it was absolutely reasonable to believe that this would continue. It just that it didn't. Now, it's not that it didn't in every market. So there's still plenty of markets here that are highly competitive. Retail, for instance, is pretty competitive. We can complain about Amazon and Walmart, but they compete with each other, and so prices, their margins are not very high. So there are some markets that are still competitive, but by and large, if you look at the things that matter for people, which is transportation, energy, healthcare, and then access to new technologies like via broadband, this just sucks. I mean, people get ripped off. It's crazy. Like they pay 2.5 times what every other normal country should pay. I mean, the numbers are, it's important to keep like the order of magnitude. Like in Europe, or actually forget Europe, in every developed market, the price of broadband connection is somewhere between $30 and $40 per month. In the US, it starts at 70. And that's if you're lucky, okay? So it's not like 10% more, it's twice the price. And for cell phone, it's even worse. For cell phone, it's probably 2 or 3 times. So at the end of the day, when you look at it, just your telecom bill in the US takes away maybe $100 to $150 extra per month compared to what you should be paying if you didn't have these monopolies in front of you. Now, if you think about the median household in the US, we know that many of them feel that it would be difficult to cope with an emergency expense of a few $100s. So if you're draining $100 or so per month from their pocket just because of bad regulation in the telecom market, that's terrible. You know, that's just the telecom market. If you add up all the places where I find significant evidence of monopoly rents, it's more like $500 per month. So that's a lot of money.
So you're talking about this in the context of America. You're in New York City right now. You still live there and teach there. And we don't have to dwell on this point, but to a large extent, the same is true in Canada, is it not? The cell phone prices and broadband prices are higher here than they are in Europe.
Yeah, I was looking at the data actually since we had this discussion before. It looks like Canada is a bit in between, but closer to the US in the cell phone and broadband markets. But then there are other markets where it's much, like healthcare is another big one, and where it seems that people have much better access to healthcare in Canada. So, but in terms of the telecom looks a bit more like the US. The thing that's important, of course, to keep in mind is now we are talking about whether consumers get a good deal. That's not the same as saying that US companies are not competitive. Like many US companies are very competitive in the sense that they sell product that everybody wants to buy around the world, and especially more true in the IT business. So it's totally consistent to have a view where many markets in the US have much more monopoly power than they should. At the same time, Google and Apple are quite innovative and very successful globally. And these are completely consistent with each other. And when people think about the US, broadly speaking, they put the two pieces together, you know. But if you live here, these are two different things. You know, are you getting a good deal as a consumer? It's different from is Google successful as a company?
So I want to make sure we kind of define some of the terms and parameters here a little bit and the context, because there are people who would argue, okay, well, what's happening in the United States is the product of a free market. There are companies that are buying each other and growing and buying out the competition, buying smaller competitors or players. That's what leads to monopolies or markets being dominated by 2 or 3 major companies, that is the free market system, and that to stop that from happening would require government intervention, which is antithetical to free markets. So how do you sort of square all of that?
So, I mean, there are several levels of analysis. At one extreme, you can just say that it's a little bit silly because free market just never existed before we had some kind of rule of law and interventions. You know, like there was no free market at the time of the East India Company. These are all big monopolies. And then the only way you get free market is you have to make sure there is some competition. And that only happens in modern countries with the rule of law. So that the rule of law is already an intervention by the government. Antitrust, price fixing, these are all things that are defined by the rule of law. So there is no such thing as free market that would exist by themselves. But I think maybe people have something different in mind, which is having a monopoly is not necessarily a bad thing, in the sense that if it depends how you got there to some extent. And I agree with that. So in fact, I think one of the very first chapters in the book is about good versus bad concentration. So you could have, if a firm is very successful and becomes dominant in its market, it's first a good thing because, you know, it means that it became successful, so it gave good products and people are happy, and that's good for growth and good for everyone. So clearly, the success of a firm is a good thing. If as a side effect, it leads to that firm having a lot of market share, so be it, it's fine. So I don't have anything against this kind of good type of concentration. But this is not really what we see in the data. What we see in the data is firms keeping their market share high and their profits high by preventing entry and competition. So that's more the thing that I find troublesome. And there are plenty of signs of that. One is just the fact that there is the turnover at the top of industries has declined in recent years. So the monopolies are not just higher, they are more persistent over time. So that contradicts, for instance, the view of the US as a place where there is always changes. Again, it used to be true. It was very true in the 1990s, for instance, but it is just not true anymore. So that's one issue. And then if you look at the way they also protect their rents by either bullying all of the would-be competitors or buying them up with aggressive acquisitions, what we call killer acquisitions, or lobbying the regulators to get the type of regulation that prevent anybody from entering their markets, that's the bad type of monopolies. And in a modern economy, you always have both types. There's never an example where you have only the bad types or only the good types. So the only interesting question is, on balance, do you see more of the good type or the bad type concentration? And what I find in the data is that, at least my claim is that up to the 1990s, there was plenty of dynamics where industries were going up and down and concentration going up and down in some markets. But broadly speaking, most of the dynamics were consistent with good concentration, which is the leader winning and therefore getting a high market share. Not so much the leader preventing anybody from entering the market. And since 2000, we see relatively more of the second type of bad concentration.
So is it as simple as this, that by and large, the cost of delivering services in Europe and the United States is similar, and that in the United States, there's a greater concentration of market share on a smaller number of players, and they're making more money, that their margins are higher than companies in Europe?
Well, so that's obviously true for the telecom market. It's obviously true for the airlines. It's obviously true for the energy market to a large extent. And the healthcare market, it's also true, but it's such a mess that it's very hard to make an apple-to-apple comparison. Simply because the healthcare system in the US is so completely insane that nobody has anything that looks like it, because nobody is crazy enough to design something as crazy as that. So it's hard to find a group to compare it to. But you would find in the healthcare market, if you try to break it down by providers of care, hospitals and insurance companies and pharmaceuticals, you would find very clear examples of monopoly rents that are growing. So I think that's exactly true. Then some other industries, the US looks pretty good. And some other industries, like if you buy a car, car manufacturing is so competitive globally, I don't think it matters very much where you are.
So how is government complicit in this? Because that's obviously a part of the equation. And I think for one example of the situations where monopolies are formed by the merger of two large players, or near monopolies are formed by the merger of two large players, they have to go before government tribunals, competition bureaus, that sort of thing, to make their case. And their case is always, of course, that it's going to be better for consumers if there is a larger player that is not susceptible to competition, particularly international competition in some areas. That's the justification they use. But if that's not what ends up happening, then is that government's fault?
Yes, I think at that point you have to be clear that it's to a large part it's government's fault. So that's why also the comparison with Europe is somewhat interesting, because Europe didn't have a tradition of free market, and it didn't have a tradition of independent regulators either. In fact, if you think about the most extreme example, my country, France, we had the tradition of Colbertism, which means state intervention in the economy, meaning the Minister of Finance playing Legos with industrial companies to build the little things he wants to build. That's the tradition of the country, not at all the tradition of arm's length regulator independent from politicians, just enforcing the rule of the game and consumer welfare. So it's interesting to see that what changed in Europe is a move towards this set of regulation, independent regulators, consumer welfare, away from the old state intervention model. And it happened mostly because it was inconsistent with the construction of the European market to keep countries independently trying to prop up their national champions. That would have ended up in a mess and would have hurt everybody. So the way to think about it is, when we designed the rules of the single market in Europe, you had to make sure that the French and the Germans would agree, and then all the other countries would agree too. So what were these guys thinking? Well, the French guy is thinking, gee, I like my regulator at home to be, close to me, so I can decide who is going to be allowed to merge with whom, who's going to get the license for doing that. So I keep the control. But at the European level, I really worry that the Germans will be able to influence the Commission against me. The Germans are thinking the same. They're thinking, well, it's nice to have a single market with the French, but if the French take over the Commission and decide everything in their interest, that's going to suck. So they then looking at each other like, okay, maybe we can design the rules of the game so that neither of us can really influence the Commission. And we make the market regulator independent from political pressure. And then you have all the other smaller countries. And what are they thinking? They're thinking, okay, it's great to have a single market, then we can export, we can have a dynamic economy, everybody's gonna, except if these two big countries can decide for everybody else, that's gonna suck. So we would never join a club if the rules of the game could be influenced by the two major players. And so for them, it was also very clear they needed that kind of reassurance. And it's not like a artificial, or it's not like a theoretical example. It happened many, many times. The most recent one was the merger of two train companies, Alstom and Siemens, which was a huge controversy in Europe when the great market regulator in Europe, Margaret Vestager, despite lobbying by both Berlin and Paris, said no to the merger. And secretly, all the other countries, the 25 other countries, were like, thanks God, because they knew they would be totally screwed if the big companies in France and Germany had been allowed to merge. So that's the equilibrium in Europe. So it's fundamentally a change in politics. In the US, it's the reverse that happened to some extent. But I think many of the deep causes are also political. The problem is in the US is that you probably need to think industry by industry. So you were asking about mergers. So one example then would be airlines. So airlines, 20 years ago, there were 8, major airlines that would cover at least not the whole country, but most of it. And today you have 4. So you went from 8 to 4. That's not like a gigantic change. Yes, it is a gigantic change. You divided the number of competitors by 2. So of course it's going to have a big impact on the market. It happened via merger.
Presumably while the market was growing too, right?
Well, no, actually, it started after 9/11.
Okay.
So yes and no. So I mean, like the trigger point was after 9/11. Of course, the airline companies lost tons of money, and so then there was a question. Okay, maybe we should allow at least perhaps one merger, and you could make the case after 9/11. Maybe all the costs of security. Maybe there was like a plausible case to say maybe we should go from 8 to 7. Okay, but once you start that thing, and the airline said, oh, we're going to 8 to 7. Why don't we try 7 to 6? Oh, that worked again. And let's keep going. And then the last one, 5 to 4, everybody knew it was completely insane. But then the regulators were like, okay, we allowed the first 3. What's the reason for not allowing the 4th one? They were like stuck in their own game. And so they allowed the last one. And that's when you went from 8 to 4. After that, it's game over because it's very hard to enter. These 4 airlines had control of the major airport landing slots. Nobody can enter at that point. So that's how you end up with this cartel. So
I know it's difficult to pinpoint, and every industry is different. But just to use that example, and when you talk about the airlines post 9/11, of course, the justification would be the risk of failure on the part of one of these big players, which would lead to a huge loss in employment because they all employ tens of thousands of people. Is that what drives it? And I wonder what the how valid that argument is, because presumably if there's a market for people to fly, that someone will, if a major airline fails, other players will step into that space to fill the void. And certainly we've seen that happen in Europe. There's been lots of change in the different kinds of companies serving the airline market in Europe.
We have EasyJet and Ryanair that do low cost.
Yeah. So is that a misplaced fear that government lawmakers are susceptible to, that they worry about the loss of jobs when a big company fails, and so they agree to these mergers kind of reluctantly because that will preserve the jobs, when in fact, if a company failed, there might be some short-term pain, but someone else would move into the market and it would keep the spirit of competition and the free market alive?
Yeah, it's mostly a bogus argument, but it's not surprising if you think about the line of reasoning. So the first thing is to distinguish failures and the job story. The job story is obvious. It's just like if you are, a monopoly and you talk with your lawyers about what's the strategy you're going to use, what's the PR strategy for getting approval for a merger, presumably you're not going to say, I'm going to increase prices and cut the number of jobs. Presumably you're going to say, well, I have synergies and therefore I'm going to lower my cost, I will be lower my price. And on top of it, I'm going to save a lot of jobs. So you're always going to claim these things. They never happen ex post, but you don't care anymore. Okay, so that's kind of classic. There's nothing surprising there. I think it's kind of, we should just not listen to these arguments because they are silly, but they still make them. The failure part is even more interesting. Failure, there is a rationale, there might be a rationale for preventing a company from failing if you think that the failure would destroy some specific assets that are hard to replace. So for instance, imagine today, is there a rationale for avoiding the failure of Airbus in Europe or Boeing in the US? It's not obvious. There might be, because there's lots of specific knowledge in these companies. There's a huge network of providers, subcontractors, and that's already a place where there are only two major players in the world. So you can, it's a serious discussion. I think that there is actually an argument. You might be against it, but there is an argument for it. In the case of airlines, though, that was really bogus because airlines had been operating in bankruptcy half of the time anyway, and they work very well in bankruptcy. They don't fail. You see, they just reorganize. That's a big thing. When you go to Chapter 11 in the US, the bankruptcy chapter, you don't go there as an airline. You definitely don't go there to close down. You go there to renegotiate your labor contract with your pilots. Or your debt with your creditors, or the terms on the lease of the planes.
Yeah.
That is completely fine, and that has nothing to do with economic costs, right? It's just purely like a bargaining, like a renegotiation. So you should just let them do that. And I think that if politicians who think that it's very costly to do so, that either they are misled or they pretend to hear something that's not there.
Yeah, there's a difference between bankruptcy and bankruptcy protection, and they're often used interchangeably by the media. But in fact, in bankruptcy protection, you're not going bankrupt. You're just, as you say, renegotiating a lot of things to get more favorable deals, right? So let's talk about the impact of this, because you touched on it earlier. What is the result of this, and how does it impact on affordability, on equality, on the growing gap between rich and poor?
Yeah, so if you think about the impact of all of that, so what I do in the book is I look at all the industries and I try to quantify the extent to which profit margins or markups by firms have increased too much, either relative to what they used to be in the US or relative to comparable markets in Europe, or both. And my kind of number at the end is that prices for the typical basket of goods that households buy are about 7% too high, somewhere between 7 and 10% too high. So what does that translate into? Well, so you can think of it as it's going to have two effects. It's going to shrink the size of the economy because monopoly firms don't expand. They don't have an incentive to compete as hard for market share. Therefore, they don't try to expand as much. Therefore, they don't produce, hire, invest as much. They also don't try to innovate as much oftentimes. So that's going to shrink the pie, and to the tune of about $1 trillion per year, about 5% of private GDP. So my estimate is that if we could go back to a competitive economy, the competitive economy, think of the 1990s, it's pretty wild. Firms are entering and exiting all the time, but the economy is booming because everybody is trying very hard to increase their market share. So that economy would be 5% larger, which is about $1 trillion per year. And that's a net gain, if you want, for society as a whole. Then you have the second effect, which is the redistribution. And of course, when firms compete more for market share and they are more aggressive in trying to pursue or to woo consumers, profits tend to fall. So on top of this aggregate increase of the pie, you would have a redistribution because you would have lower dividends and shares buyback, so lower profits, but you would have higher wages, so that in fact profit would drop by about 500 billion and wages would go up by about 1.5 trillion. Okay, so the total 1 trillion increase is not evenly divided between capital owners and workers. It goes more towards workers. So then if you trace it back a bit more finely within the income distribution of the US, the median family in the US earns about $50,000 per year, give or take, okay? But that median family in the US, median household, I mean, typically doesn't have a lot of capital income, because capital income, the ownership of capital tend to be very unevenly distributed. So most of the dividend payments and share buyback profits accrue to the top of the distribution. So the median household doesn't have that much capital income. So therefore, from their perspective, if you go back to a competitive economy, the fact that profits are going down, it doesn't really matter that much. The fact that wages are going up, real wages, that is wages per unit of like purchasing power adjusted. So the real purchasing power of what you earn, the fact that that's going up, that helps them a lot. So for them, in fact, my best estimate is that their standards of living would go up by as much as 10%. It's quite a bit more than just the average figure, because essentially they benefit fully from the wages and they don't have the drop in capital income like the very rich would experience. So 10%, that means about $5,000 per year. So it's a bit like saying if you had a competitive economy today, it's as if you were writing a $5,000 check to the median household. The very rich would lose because they would have fewer dividends and share buyback. The very poor, I don't think it would help them that much because they don't work very much. Definitely not in the private sector. So much of their income is actually payment from the state, so that wouldn't change that much. So it's not like a anti-poverty. It's really a middle class and lower middle class policy. It's not like an anti-poverty policy.
So I find that interesting because we just had an election in Canada a year ago where I don't think any politician went 5 minutes without talking about the middle class. That was the target demographic that they were mining for votes. So if there are policies that would help the middle class, surely they would embrace them. But do they not understand them? Are they worried that voters won't understand this issue? Is it too complicated? What do you think is at the heart of the failure of government to address this issue?
I mean, there might be a bit of misunderstanding. You have, specifically in the US, you have the issue of the court system. So we can get back to that. But that's a kind of, I think that's more like a US specific issue. So I think it's mostly lobbying, because every time you try to do something about that, you realize that as soon as you propose a policy that would make the markets more competitive, the losers are there. The losers are the big monopolies, and they start to explain that really you can't do that, that it would be bad for everybody. And they have a lot of money to convince politicians that this is true. So, so I think that's the first order effect. But to be perfectly honest, there are also some industries where people play a lot the China card. That is, they say, oh, sure, monopolies are bad, but we need our own monopolies to fight against the Chinese monopolies. That's an argument that you hear a lot. In fact, I was striking. That's an argument I used to hear a lot in Europe. But I started hearing it more and more in Washington. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. They learned the playbook from Europe. Like, pretend that you're really worried about fighting the foreign monopolies and to justify your own monopolies. That's interesting. Sometimes it's true, but 95% of the time it's not.
So it's about power and money ultimately. And when you say lobbying, does that include campaign financing in the US?
Well, in the US, yes. So in the US, I think that I think there are two things that are probably important in the background. One is, so as we said earlier, it's not totally clear exactly what changed in the US, but I can still describe a few proximate causes or ideas. The one is the long-term trend in the judiciary. So starting in the 80s, so we have to rewind a little bit. Let's go back to the 70s and 60s. There was a lot of activism in the court, and in particular, but everywhere, but in particular in the antitrust. And you could make a reasonable case that perhaps they went a little bit overboard in some cases. And there was a backlash against that, led by several intellectuals, many of them located in Chicago. So then it was called like the Chicago School of Antitrust, which argued that the government should just get out of the business of regulating monopolies. And the main argument was that, look, if there is a monopoly, that means firms are making fat margins, they're going to attract competitors who are going to try to enter and steal some of these fat profits. And therefore, you don't need to worry about it because it's going to be self-correcting. So it was just a version of the self-correction of the market. And there was some truth to that. In fact, in the data in the 1970s, you see that. You see that if an industry looks like it has fat margins, you can predict that it will have a lot of entry over the subsequent 5 years. That used to be true. The problem is today, when I rank industries by how fat the margins are, I don't predict entry anymore. There's just no, that relationship has disappeared. So that is and the problem is that the judges haven't adapted to that. They still think that really monopolies are self-regulating. And that brainwashing took place over 30 years, and it was very deliberate. It was like a clear policy that was implemented by groups who wanted to push this agenda to change the belief system of the court. And that was a bit specific to the US, but this is long-term trend that started to really become strong enough, I guess, to tip the balance in the 2000s. And in the 2000, the other, like the second wave, if you want, came on top of that, which was the large increase in lobbying, both in campaign finance contribution and then in lobbying expenditures. But typically, the two are linked because if you talk to lobbyists in Washington, it's very clear what the deal is. First, you pay for my campaign. If you pay for my campaign, if and when I win, I might listen to you as a lobbyist. But if you didn't pay for my campaign, the fact that you're a lobbyist is useless because I'm not going to even open the door. So you pay for the campaign to get access, and then you lobby to get what you want. And that, for some reason, really increased in size in the 2000s. Quantitative, just like multiplied by 2 or 3 as a fraction of, say, GDP. And why exactly at that point in time, I don't know. I've heard various ideas, but I don't have a full-fledged theory there.
I want to talk about what governments should be doing to restore the free markets, but we haven't touched a lot on this so far, and there's a very provocative chapter title in your book, Why Are Bankers Paid So Much? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I was looking at banking part from my previous research, and it's also an interesting industry because the regulations are so important in banking that you can see their quantitative impact. And I was struck by 2 things. The first is that for all the fuss about finance and innovations in finance, I didn't see much true innovation in the data, in the sense that the cost of providing financial services didn't seem to have decreased at all since the 1960s, which is kind of strange because you're like, if they have computers, shouldn't that be cheaper? And not really, actually. So I was puzzled by that, and I realized that it was very hard to enter, and so you didn't have competition, and so the bankers were able to translate all of their profit margin to higher wages for themselves. That was true until the big crisis. Thankfully, since then it's changed a bit, not as much as we might want, but it's still significantly better. So in large part because of new fintech firms, they put pressure finally. So you get, as a consumer, you start to get a better deal in some industries. Not in banking that much. Banking is still, personal banking in the US is still, I think, very expensive. For the typical household, the quality of banking services is really bad. But if you look at asset management, when you're saving for your retirement, that got a lot better. It's a lot cheaper today. So that's pretty good.
So we're going to get to audience questions in just a moment. And again, if you're with us on Zoom, please type the question into the Q&A function on the Zoom interface. And if you're on Facebook, just type the question in there and we'll get to as many questions as we can. But before we do,
in fact, we should talk about, well, since you brought up Facebook, clearly when we talk about monopolies, at some point we're going to talk about Google, Facebook, and Amazon. So.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that. I have 2 questions left. One was about that and about the role of these giant multinational digital players. and the digital economy. But the first is, what is your advice to government then? What would you tell the US government on how to restore the free market to what it was before 2000?
So I think that there is so first of all, I think you should think of it as a long-term plan because there are many steps. And you should try to go for the low-hanging fruits first, and then move along. So to me, the low-hanging fruits, probably I would argue for the telecom business, because like your broadband bill and your cell phone bill it's an expense you cannot change. So for most people, it's a fixed expense every month. It's very hard to get a job if you don't have a cell phone. So people lose their job, they still need to have a cell phone, right? So I think that market is ripe for that, because pretty much everybody's paying the same price, whether you're very rich or middle class, you're kind of paying the same price per month for your telecom, for your either again broadband or cell phone services. So if you could reduce that price, the relative impact would be much. Essentially, the rich people wouldn't notice. I mean, rich people, like you tell them you're paying $150 per month for your cell phone, or 200 or 75. Honestly, they probably don't even see the difference. But if you're middle class, that's a big difference. So, and that one, I think we know how to do it. You need to increase competition. The only way you do it is by making it easier for entrants to come and compete. So you need to either literally force competition or force incumbents to rent out some of their spectrum so that entrants can enter. Same with the broadband. The broadband is a bit more at the state level because you have all the connection and stuff like that. So I think people should put pressure on their state and municipalities to lower this cost. But that one to me is like number one, because that has a direct impact on what people can keep in their pockets at the end of the month. Then if you move to like the long term, the more you do that, the more you need to think about more like structural changes. And I think that some kind of sensible regulation of campaign finance contribution would be helpful at some point. It's kind of, now you might think, well, it's a wild dream, then maybe, but on the other hand, if the alternative is, so I'll tell you what I don't like. What I don't like is, would be a solution where we try to use antitrust to solve all kinds of issues in society. Like big firms have too much power, I just break them up because they are too big. That's not great, because sometimes they are big for a good reason. Sometimes they are big for the wrong reason. You just don't want them to have too much influence. But if it's really efficient for them to be big, you don't want to prevent them from being big. What you don't want is for them to be big and then get so much political clout that you can't regulate them anymore. Now, if you're worried about that, it's much better to regulate the elections, to have some sensible election limits on contribution for political campaigns, rather than trying to use antitrust to solve these problems. So I actually think in the long run, that's kind of the ultimate goal. And in between this, so I'd say in the short term, try the telecom market. Then next, of course, do something about the high-tech industry that we're going to discuss in 2 minutes. The very long term, you have this kind of campaign finance reform. And in the medium term, I think that the way to get there, at least in my mind, is to try to get a little bit of bipartisan support. If you look at the history of antitrust in the US, the times where it was successful was the time where there was some agreement between Democrats and Republicans. And in theory, there's no reason why they wouldn't agree on that. I mean, what's a good deal for consumers? It doesn't really matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat. You should agree with that. It used to be true. And I think there is some scope for getting that kind of consensus back.
Okay, well, forgive me if I'm not optimistic about that at the moment. But let's talk. Yeah, we'll see. I'm not sure everything changes as a result of the outcome in the election, but we'll see. So let's talk about Google, Amazon, and Facebook, and the role of the digital economy and the trends that you're describing.
So to me, so first of all, that's a typical case where competition is clearly helpful, not competition is terrible. And it's also a clear case where you begin to be worried that these firms are too big for many reasons, not just the market, but also their political influence and their influence on various kinds of outcomes in society. So that tells you that something deeply rotten in the system. On the other hand, it's also a market where some of these firms became big because they were very successful. And so you don't want to just prevent them from getting big just because you're worried about big firms. So I think they encapsulate, in other words, if you go back to our discussion at the beginning, good concentration and bad concentration, what's fascinating in the tech business is it's clearly a mix of the both. Like every one of these, Microsoft, Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, all of these firms are both amazingly innovative, bringing great services and terrible monopolies at the same time, okay? And there is no hope to make them perfect in all dimensions. So the only question is how do you strike the right balance? So that's kind of I think that's the right framework to think about it. After that, I think they're all a bit different. So there are places where say, Amazon and Apple, where I think that the solution is not that complicated in the sense that there are a couple of issues that have to do with, in Apple, the App Store, in Amazon, how they treat their third-party sellers on their website, where they just need to be slapped on the wrist and start behaving correctly. But I don't think that would challenge their core business. It's just that I think these guys just became bullies, essentially. It's not like they don't need to be bullies. They just became bullies because they could. So you just, beat them up a little bit so they don't stop behaving like bullies, but that doesn't entail changing their business model, just making them behave a bit better on the App Store or vis-a-vis third-party sellers in the case of Amazon. So that's kind of for these guys. For Google and Facebook, it's more complicated because these guys, I think it's hard to imagine a business model where there's no drastic change and things are good. The case of Facebook, it is a complete monopoly on social networks. They got it by acquiring their competitors and preventing anybody from entering. Now, that's not great. And on top of it, if you look at the trends, the time where Facebook started to stop respecting its own commitment to privacy is exactly the time where the last competitors left. In other words, as long as they had some competition, they felt like if they misbehave with respect to your privacy, your data, they could be punished by you leaving Facebook to go to another social platform. And somehow that kept them in check. Since then, it's been open bar. So, and I don't think there's a simple solution there without some true change. Now, hopefully, maybe Zoom could become a competitor at some point. Maybe like, some of these new platforms that are emerging thanks to COVID could become a true challenger, but you need something drastic there. For Google, there's also like deep down a conflict of interest. They have monopolized the search engine. They use it to then monopolize the market for advertisement and screw everybody around. And that's the core of their business model. See, it's not like, their search engine is pretty good. So you could say that's they have something there, which is a unique asset, fine. But it's not like Amazon, where Amazon has such an amazing technology from the cloud to the inventory management and everything in between, that even if you just make them a bit more competitive or force them to misbehave a bit less, I don't think it's going to change that much. For Google, it's just like the way they monopolize the advertisement market looks suspicious. It's full of conflict of interest. I don't see an easy solution that does not involve a pretty drastic change there.
Okay. Let's get to some audience questions. Richard writes, any views on banking and financial services, including the so-called fintechs? In Canada, we have a banking oligopoly and not a lot of progress on open banking, where Europe seems ahead.
Yeah, so I think that the fintech is a good opportunity that many countries are using to force their banks to become more competitive and more user-friendly. Now, you can do it at your own pace. So, Canada, you could say maybe the mixed blessing of having had such a successful big financial crisis, essentially, but not having a big financial crisis in 08 and 09 where everybody else was blowing up. So that was great at the time. Of course, then it reinforced a little bit maybe the monopolies of the big banks. So, maybe that's like a mixed blessing because of that. But globally for fintech, I'm reasonably optimistic in the sense that once the solutions are there, they tend to spread. So even if Canada doesn't do that much, if something truly successful happens in Europe or the US, we'll be able to import it. So I think, you know, you can do it at your own pace. The only thing I would say is that in the US, that's less true in Canada. But in the US, you still have people who are poor and get really, really bad banking services, like shamefully bad. That's a bit less true in Canada. So to me, that's where I think the US really needs to do some work.
All right. Jordana has a question. I'm curious to hear your perspective on the state of the private higher education industry in the United States, the level of competition, the underlying drivers of increasingly higher costs to consumers, meaning students.
Yes, that's a great question. So in fact, I think that so first of all, in the US, you know, we also have these for-profit colleges. That's a complete disaster. That's a sham. Okay, that's just ridiculous. So I don't think that, but I think she's thinking about true universities that are still private, like mine, for instance, NYU. So that I think is also shamefully bad. If you look at the data, I think that the industries that are dragging down growth, or the places where people spend a lot more than they should, and where we see zero improvement in recent years, have been healthcare, especially in the US, healthcare and education. You know, finance to some extent, we talked about telecom, and there are other cases where you would like this guy to do much better. But there are two places where we really spend a fortune and we don't see much improvement, and that's healthcare and education. So education is one of them. The equation for education is not that complicated. You know, productivity is the number of students you can teach. The cost is the wage of the professor. So if the wage of the professor goes up with the same as the economy or even a bit faster, then there will be zero productivity growth and you're going to pay higher tuitions. That's as simple as that. The only way you improve that is by finding a way for teachers to teach more students while still giving them like extremely tailored advice, feedback, and great quality of education. And the fact that we haven't been able to do that, the truth is, it's not just we haven't been able, is that there was very little incentive in the system to even try to come up with something innovative to do that. I think that's a shame. And I hope, although I'm not holding my breath, that maybe COVID is going to push us in that direction. Because finally, we are forced to, you know, improve a bit our IT systems, use online teaching, discovering that with online teaching, maybe we can deliver the same content more efficiently, so maybe to more students at a slightly lower cost. So I'm a little bit hopeful, but at the end of the day, the big problem is still that there is no competition. It's very hard to enter that game. And so until we fix that, it's going to be hard to see progress.
All right, here's a question from Paul. Can it be argued that the United States is in decline, economic, trade, political decline in relation to China, with the latter becoming the superpower replacing the US?
And will there be a war like between Athens and Sparta? That's the book, right? Yeah. So historically, every time you had a switch in power, at least not always, out of 13 out of 17 times there was a war between the two. And the question is, will it happen this time between China and the US? You know, maybe not. I think that like clearly compared to 20 years ago, we are much more pessimistic now. 20 years ago, we were very optimistic about China because we thought that they were on the path towards being, you know, a bit more like moderate and slightly more democratic, and we don't believe that anymore. In terms of their economic growth, it's good, but they're mostly catching up. So they've done the easy part so far. My own prediction is that I believe that much of the growth in China since Deng, essentially, so since the 1980s and the market reforms, was because of the market reforms. And then since Xi Jinping is going back on these market reforms, bringing back state intervention, I think it's going to have a negative impact on Chinese growth in the medium term. They also have an aging population, so they're going to have plenty of issues of their own. just because of their size, that will not prevent them. See, there are two different issues. One is, are they going to catch up in terms of standards of living with the US? And that is going to take a long, long time. Are they going to catch up in absolute level, given how many people are in China? Yes, probably at some point. But then they're going to start to age faster than the US. So I think the more likely outcome is that we're going to have a duopoly. I don't think China is going to overtake the US. I think it's going to be more like a balance of power between the two for a long time.
All right. Michelle writes, I gather from your analysis that political competition in Europe, with each country looking out for its own interest, has led to competitive markets and has benefited EU consumers, whereas the political structure in the US makes it easier for a company to capture the attention of, it says the regular, but I think he means the regulator.
Yeah.
Yeah. What set of incentives would you propose to move US legislators toward favoring competitive policies?
Well, I think that I think again, like if you think about what makes what's funny in the US to some extent is not that complicated, because the US used to do it very well 20 years ago. So all you need to do is go back to what you were doing in the 1990s. Now,
right.
The only reason it sounds so hard is because in the 1990s, there was a tiny bit of bipartisan consensus about antitrust. See, it's not as if, like, if you think about, you remember Newt Gingrich and Clinton, they fought, they hated their guts, okay? In many dimensions, but in terms of the economy and, having some kind of free market good for consumers, there was some agreement. So when there was agreements about that, it was harder for lobbyists to get their way. They couldn't play one party against the other as easily. So bringing back this kind of some form of bipartisan support for this, I think it would be step number one. And now, if you look at Washington, DC, that might look hopeless. But if you go to the state level, it's not. At the state level, there is some agreement. In fact, there is a lot of agreement sometimes, even between Republican and Democrat governors on these issues. So I think that I would try to build that consensus at the state level. And then at the federal level, I would just try to have some sensible regulation to limit the power of big companies. So just to give you one example, when Amazon was looking to locate its second headquarters, it was shopping around and playing one state against the other, okay? And the states were doling money and promises of, and that was a stupid game. And everybody understood it was a stupid game. Well, in Europe, we have a rule against that. It's called state aid rules. That says simply you cannot, I mean, you have rules, you can give aid to companies, but you cannot give aid to a specific company. It has to be fair and open. And that rule would make that kind of shopping much harder in the US.
Mm. Another question from Jordana. The typical argument for fostering a free market and greater competition is that labor deregulation and therefore a greater exploitation is what's required. How do we achieve a free market while protecting labor or even improving labor conditions and wages?
So I don't think free market in terms of firms competing in the goods market is enough for a good outcome in the labor market, but I think it's certainly helpful in the sense that so first of all, the best insurance against being exploited by your employer is to have another employer next door that you can go to. So competition in that sense is pretty good, because if two firms compete in the market for goods and services, they're likely going to hire the same pool of people. They're going to also compete on the labor side. So having lots of competitors is pretty good as a worker, because you can say, I don't like my boss, I'm going to go work for the other one. In fact, what you see in the data is many of these firms, to maintain their monopolies, they make their workers sign non-compete agreements. Well, then non-competes, I think the name says it all, right? So I think competition is good for labor. The one caveat is it can push firms to cut corners. So my only caveat is, together with clear safety regulations in the workplace, so firms cannot cut too many corners. I think in the data, if you have this combination, competition and safety regulations, you get pretty good outcome for workers.
All right, we're almost out of time. Did you have any final thoughts that you wanted to share in terms of what we need to be thinking about, what some of the other lessons are from your research?
Well, I mean, one of the lessons is clearly that people should complain to their politicians if they think that they are being ripped off by companies. Like, it's not, like if you live in a place and you have only one choice to get internet connection at home, and that monopoly proposes that the entry price of the contract is $100 per month, this is not normal. You need to complain. You need to actually vote out the people who regulate these guys, because that's not how it should be. But if people are not aware of it, they don't complain and nothing changes.
All right, this has been wonderful.
Thank you
so much. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you and hearing your insights on this really important topic. Thank you so much for your time. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup. Bonne soirée.